Welcome back. We are in the final chapter of the final stage of the lifespan, which is late adulthood, people over the age of 65. And in this chapter, we're going to be talking about psychosocial development. All right, let's get started. So, as I talked about in the last age bracket, there's that normative crisis approach of development that assumes that there's periods of stability followed by some kind of crisis that triggers further development. And the most famous of those normative crisis models was Erickson's, and we are finally going to bring his model to completion in old age. So this chart, I just started it with adolescence, and then we've got the adulthood, the three stages. During the last years of life, Erickson believed that our biggest challenge was to figure out a way to look back on our past and integrate it into our personality in such a way that we could look back and say, I've lived a good life. I made some mistakes, but I did the best I could at every point, and basically feel like you've lived your life with integrity, right? And that your life has been fulfilling. If a person can't do that, they really are facing death with despair. They're wishing they could go back and do it again. They are denying things that they did that might have had impacts on other people. One of the biggest problems with the generativity stage is that oftentimes you're raising other people or you're mentoring other people, and you might make mistakes. I mean, we're all human, and we may make a bad decision that really actually had a big effect on our child or our mentee or something like that. In order to resolve the final crisis on the side of integrity, a person needs to be able to look back and say, I did mess up on that one. If I had a do-over, I would love to do it differently, but I don't have a do-over, so I have to figure out a way to acknowledge my errors. I don't need to bog down in them and be all remorseful and, oh no, I'm a horrible person because something bad happened, but instead be able to look back and say, yep, I was not perfect. That is for sure. If I had it to do again, and especially if I had it to do again knowing what I now know, I probably would make better decisions or different decisions. But given what I knew then and as I was going through it at the time, I did the best I could. And there are examples of people who don't do the best they can. I think we can all agree to that, right? Some of you may have had the displeasure of being raised by somebody who was not doing the best that they could. They were self-absorbed, they were addicted, there were other things that made them less than advantageous to be raising you. But even in those really dramatic circumstances, if that person ultimately looked back and said, man, I really wish I had it together, or didn't have such a temper, or, I'm sorry that I harmed you. I'm sorry that in some fashion, I made your life more difficult. Those kinds of things. If a person can look back with integrity, it not only makes their, later years happier, but it also can mend some of the mistakes that they imposed on other people. And I think that's the error that a lot of people make when they're actually settling this on the side of despair, is that they're like, well, there's nothing I can do about it anyway. There's no point in talking about it. And in a lot of ways, there is a point in talking about things. One of the biggest gifts a person can give somebody who they have harmed is a sincere apology for that behavior. I'm really sorry. I was not my best self back then. Maybe I was drinking too much, or I had my eyes focused on the wrong things, and, I wish that I had done things differently. I'm really thinking about some particular examples in my mind right now of people who I know who just absolutely refuse to admit anything that they did wrong in the past. And that doesn't allow the person who was harmed to really move forward, because the person who did the harm is unwilling to admit it. Well, you're just too sensitive, or, you don't have to be a baby about it, or that's years ago, it's in the past, why are you bringing it up? Those kinds of dismissals really diminish the person who was harmed and then now as an adult is asking for repair, and the harmer really can't do it. And honestly, they probably just can't do it. So if you're in that circumstance, I would just like, and I've been in this circumstance, I would just like to argue the best way to repair is not to be dependent on the harmer to ultimately admit the harm that they did. Like, it's probably not going to happen. So being able to move on in your own life with integrity will require you to be able to say, some people just can't, they couldn't be their best in that time, and they can't admit it now. And that's not about you, it's about them. So that's my best advice for how to get through those situations where you are facing an aging person who doesn't want to face the end of life with integrity. They instead want to go with denial. So, sorry, I was thinking about something specific while I was talking, so I hope that wasn't too much of a downer. But so this concludes Erickson's model. If a person resolves this last crisis on the side of integrity, the gift that they get is wisdom. The virtue that develops from that is wisdom. And, that's a really important gift to give to the, later generations, right? To be able to put things into perspective. One of the things that I've been really grateful for during the pandemic is having my mom here who can tell me about times when sort of similar things, nothing as crazy as this has happened before, where people were locked in their houses like we were. But she can give me some context about previous times that there were pandemics. In fact, I lived through a pandemic when I was 3 years old, and my entire family had a very serious flu that killed a way higher proportion of Americans than COVID. But nobody even remembers this pandemic because there weren't these big lifestyle things that happened with this pandemic. But having my mom available to share her wisdom about, this too will pass. That it's hard to imagine, but in 10 years, there will be people walking around who are conscious who have no recollection of this even happening. It's shocking. It's just when in 2011, when I started encountering people who were college students and they had no real recollection of 9/11, it was really shocking to me because, as a young adult, that was a big thing in my life. And to think that there are people, if you're a young adult right now, that there are people who are going to come up behind you and they're not going to remember this whole 2-year period that we all spent in such a limbo and all the things that we've gone through. They won't have any knowledge of it, and they'll just think it's one of those antiquated things that happened in the past that didn't involve them. And it's kind of shocking to think about, really. Wow, I'm on a really upward trajectory with today's lecture, aren't I? So let's move on to some self theories. All right, let's get more positive. The positivity effect. The positivity effect says that we perceive, prefer, and remember positive things more than negative ones. So not only will the people behind us not really remember this pandemic because they were too little or they weren't born yet, even those of us who have lived through it. I mean, I think it's the last day of February while I'm making this recording of 2022. And even now, sitting in this perspective, just 2 years out from when we were starting to hear about this coronavirus that people were starting to talk about, it's kind of hard to really put myself exactly back in that place of uncertainty and fear and things that we were all feeling, in the spring of 2020, when we were all willing to go on to just automatic online learning because we're like, okay, we gotta hunker down. We don't want everybody to catch this. And our mindset, it's really hard to remember where we were then, right? Because part of it is positivity effect. We have a tendency to perceive, prefer, and remember positive things more than negative ones. So it's kind of hard to remember negative emotions like fear or negative emotions like pain. It's hard to remember those things. And so that's actually to our benefit as we age because we tend to remember positive things more often. And so we look back on our childhood and we look back on our young adulthood and we look back on all these previous things and we tend to remember the positives and not as much the negatives. It's kind of a little selective memory that we're displaying, really. It allows us to compensate for unpleasant things. We tend to, focus on the positive, look forward. Now, some people are more optimistic and some people are more pessimistic. So, of course, this is going to vary a little bit between people. But on average, even a pessimist will remember from their childhood or from their young adulthood more positive things than negative things on average. most of the time older people will characterize unpleasant experiences as really not that consequential. They'll say, that didn't have as big of an impact on me as these like pleasant memories of going fishing with my dad, or these other kinds of like more positive things. So we sort of selectively attend to the things that are more positive, and it kind of causes like rosy retrospection, we call it, where you look back through rose-colored glasses and you really remember positive things. The great thing about that is that because we tend to focus on the positive, we tend to do that. We grant ourselves a little bit of grace like that too, which means that we're willing to look back and say that even though some negative things happened, those negative things aren't as important as the positive things that happened. And that helps us to move a little bit more towards integrity. Now, I didn't mean that in like the denial phase that I was talking about on the last slide, where, oh no, nothing bad happened, or, really you're just being a baby about it. Those kinds of things. I mean, being able to look back and say, what was my life like? How did I act? How did I raise my kids? Looking back on those things, thinking about those things through a positive lens makes it more likely that the person can say, you know what, I've lived a good life. I've raised great children, or I had a big impact at work, or whatever it is. Having that rosy retrospection makes it more likely that we'll have that kind of, selective memory for the positive. What we want is our ideal self and our real self to merge. Now, this is a Rogers, he's a personality theory named Carl Rogers, and he argued that, we all have our ideal self that we wish we were, and then we have our real self that we really are. And, I know, for example, my ideal self doesn't eat as much sugar as my real self does. My ideal self gets up every morning and says, okay, that's it. I'm off the sugar. I'm not going to eat anything with sugar in it today. Okay, 2 hours awake and we violated ideal self's goals, and real self has taken control. As we age, because of rosy retrospection, we can look back on our lives and we tend to remember ourselves having been more virtuous or more, ideally behaved, right? Like we did achieve more of our goals and things like that. When you're in the moment and you have a goal and it's unfulfilled, it kind of, it's a big thing. You're like, man, I wanted to achieve this goal. I failed. Oh no. But then in older age, you're like, I tried a lot of things. Boy, I was adventuresome, or I was not afraid of failure. Even though the failures did hurt, in your rosy retrospection, you look back and you go, hey, at least I tried. And so your ideal self and your real self really start to merge in your recollections. Now, we all know that the more we can accept ourselves, the happier we are with ourselves, right? Like if we can accept ourselves for who we are going to be happier in general. And I mean, we all have self-doubts. We all have that horrible audience that we carry around, that imaginary audience who's criticizing us all the time. And it's really just our own minds doing it to ourselves. As we age, we see that people are doing that less and less. They're less self-critical. And so therefore their recollections and their, sense of integrity and all that stuff is greater. So they tend to display more happiness. Now, this is not perfect. I mean, there are some people who to their dying day are just mean and are, cruel to other people. And I mean, this is not a guarantee. I'm not talking about everybody, obviously, but on average, what we see is most reasonably healthy people who are trying their best to be their best selves tend to have these positivity effects. All right. I think we should stop here because I have a couple of different strata that I want to talk about. So let's go ahead and save that for the next recording. So I will see you in the next one.